This week's topic is called Reconstructing Druidism. Last week, I surveyed some of the testimony from people who were around at the time that the Druidic religion of the ancient Celtic peoples would have been active, particularly, as those of you who were here last week will remember. I focused on probably the longest description, which was that of Julius Caesar in his memoirs about the Gaulish Wars. There are some other commentators from the Greek and Roman societies who did write at varying lengths and over various periods of time about the Druids and what they might have been up to and the functions they served in society. We find out little bits and pieces from some of these commentators. They give us the suggestion that there were indeed, for example, female Druids. We get a suggestion from one commentator that there might have been sort of inherited priesthoods, that particular Druids might have been serving as priests to a particular god or goddess. But these little scraps of information from some of these commentators. But the fullest account was from Julius Caesar, and he focused on several functions of the Druids in their traditional societies in which they lived, that they were very much responsible, that they were essential to the performance of public ceremonies, public religious rituals, of the offering of sacrifice, which was key to most of the pre-Christian religions in Europe and also in other Indo-European language-speaking societies like in ancient India and in ancient Persia. The offering of essentially gifts and by extension hospitality to the gods and goddesses and to other spirits was really a hallmark of these ancient religions. And the Druids were, said by Caesar and others, to be responsible for the proper conduct of these rituals. And so therefore, when the community gathered for seasonal ritual or things of that nature, or for example, the inauguration of a king, Druids would be seen to be presiding over that, essential to the proper performance of these rituals. Caesar talks about the role of the Druid as essentially a jurist, as presiding over legal disputes and rendering what one would hope were just verdicts. And these, it's suggested, are based on precedent. I often compare this, and I'll be talking about this in a future lecture on traditional law codes, to Talmudic learning in the Jewish religion, where centuries of disputation and discussion and precedent and interpretation build up, and the scholars are expected to learn these precedents and these traditions. That's very much, I think, what Druidic training, and particularly Druidic legal reasoning and legal judgment would have been like. It would have been based on the acquisition of many centuries, many generations of precedent built up in the community. And Caesar talks about a few other things, but those are, it seems to me, the two most important functions that he focuses on. And then he discusses briefly, as we talked about last week, the training of the Druids as taking many years. Caesar indicates 20. And the most salient feature of that is that the acquisition of, the memorization, the rote memorization of the lore of the community was what was key to the training of the Druid, that they did not write things down, that they refrained from writing, and that in fact that was intentional. It wasn't that they were illiterate. They did have forms of writing in the Celtic cultures, the traditional Celtic cultures, but they abstained from it, particularly with their sacred things, because they felt that the function of memory of their Druids, of their priesthoods, if you will, was so critical that it could not be allowed to degrade, that the exercise of memory, the development and the maintenance of the function of memory was critical, that it was key, that it was central to the Druids and their work. So one side effect of this is that by not writing things down, the customs and the practices and the rituals of the ancient Druids, of this pre-Christian and slightly overlapping with Christian religious tradition, was effectively lost to us. We have only some indirect testimony from people like Julius Caesar about what the Druids were up to, what their roles were in their society. We have suppositions we can make from archaeological evidence, from the depositing of objects into what were obviously sacred sites, such as springs and certain lake shores and so on, burial sites and so forth. And we have some scraps of information, not only from what little survives of Celtic mythology that was set down by Christian monks and other scribes, but also little bits and pieces here and there in some of the Christian text, like the saints' lives. There's a passage in the life of St. Patrick, for example, that while it's meant to show the superiority of the saint over his Druid counterparts, these pagan priests, in doing so, by virtue of what the biographer describes the Druids as doing, and also Patrick even as doing, we get some indication of the nature of the religious rituals that were going on at the time. But again, it's indirect. We have to infer the actual customs from scraps of indirect evidence. And so that's, in a sense, going to be the focus for what I'm going to be talking about this evening, which is the need to have to reconstruct Druidism, the need to reconstruct what is effectively a lost tradition. You'll get sort of conflicting points of view about just how lost Druidism is. Certainly I see on the internet all the time people who say that they're from Druid families and that they were taught Druid practice by their mother or their grandmother or their grandfather or whoever, sometimes in Ireland or Wales and sometimes here in North America. And I think it's important to understand that there's a legitimate confusion of terminology there. What I'm talking about in these lectures is sort of ancient, primarily ancient, pre-Christian practice of the Druidic religion, the traditional religion of the Celtic peoples. But the word Druid did survive down through the Middle Ages in places like particularly Ireland. But its meaning shifted, and it became something a little bit closer to sorcerer or hedge witch. It became, or cunning man or cunning woman, which is a term we find in England in more recent years. It took on the meaning of sort of conjurer, sorcerer, or just simply magician. And in fact, in the Irish language, I'm given to understand the word has come to mean magic in a sense that can even apply to stage magic. So you could think of latter-day Druids or people who identified themselves as Druids as being folk magicians, not necessarily religious priests and practitioners, not the sort of Druid that Caesar and others described, somebody who was absolutely central to the spiritual, ethical, legal life of their society. There are also arguments about the degree to which ancient Druidism survives in somewhat diminished form within the bardic traditions, the poetic traditions of places like Ireland and Wales. We do have, and I will talk at length about that in the lecture on the bardic traditions, we do have systems of training that we have bits and pieces of descriptions of, some of them actually quite full, that resonate strongly, as I indicated last week, with Caesar's description of the training of the Druids over a period of many years that involves the memorization of many verses. So there is probably something to be said for the argument that the training of poets in post-Middle Ages, Ireland, Wales, and elsewhere, into even fairly recent centuries, does have a structure to it, that there's a methodology in training poets that is reminiscent of and probably ultimately evolved out of the original training of the Druid priests of the ancient Celtic countries. But as a religion, as a system of ideologies, of customs, of major public rituals happening on certain important events, certain important festival occasions during the year, Druidism was very much stamped out by Christianity. Some of its folk customs, I should say, some of its customs became folk practice, practiced by Christian peoples within the Celtic nations. But as a religious system that involved the offering of sacrifice to many gods and goddesses and local spirits and so on. Things like, customs like the inauguration of an important figure like a king, involving the sacrifice of an animal and the symbolic mating of the ruler with the land, with the sovereignty goddess in the land. Those sorts of things were very much discouraged and in some cases completely outlawed in Christianity. And Ireland and Britain both converted quite early. We have indications of Christian communities in southern Britain and in probably southern Ireland before 200 AD, 200 of the current era. And we have good reason to believe that Ireland, say, converted in the mid-5th century. Pretty early on. Other places like Scandinavia, that happened much later, closer to as late as, say, 1000 AD in Iceland. So the Celtic countries actually did convert to Christianity pretty early on. So the pushing aside of the pagan religious practices happened starting relatively early. And so again, there's less opportunity for continuity of tradition, of religious tradition, as opposed to folk custom or superstition or folk magic surviving down through the years. And I think it's possible to overestimate continuity. I see the word Culdee, for example. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, Culdee. I see that thrown around, the sort of notion of a Culdee church as being a sort of a remnant of a kind of a merging of paganism and Christianity. And really, Culdee is just a corruption of Caeli Dei, which essentially means servant of God. Not too terribly different from the implications of the supposedly mysterious shadow organization Opus Dei that figures in Dan Brown's book, Da Vinci Code. The Caeli Dei were a lay organization. They were lay brothers and sisters as opposed to those who had taken formal religious oaths and orders. They were given to simplicity, but they were quite Christian. They were quite actually conservative in their Christianity and very much attached to ultimately Roman Christianity. And it's sort of become this sort of interesting romantic myth that the Chaldees were this sort of Druidic orders finding their way into Christianity. First of all, the word doesn't appear until quite late. Chaldee doesn't appear until very late, I think the 17th century, if I remember correctly, in Scotland. So it's a kind of a fanciful romanticization, a little bit of wishful thinking. Because people want to believe that there is this unbroken tradition. If you're drawn to wanting to practice or be inspired by the image of the Druids or the Bards or the other ancient Celtic religious officials, if you're going to just derive inspiration in your life from that, I think there's something that provides a sense of security if you can believe that that tradition is really deeply seated in time and that many people down through many generations have practiced it. Sadly, and unfortunately, in reality, it's probably not so much true. And so we're left, as I say, to reconstruct Druidism. That word reconstruction and a related word, Reconstructionism, basically comes out of linguistics. Reconstructionism is a linguistic enterprise, firstly. I've mentioned Indo-European languages once already tonight. And I'm going to get into that in much more detail in just a moment here. But one of the reasons that we believe that there are language families is because we recognize resemblances in the vocabulary and grammars of different languages. And out of that, we assume that there was some sort of descent from a common parent language. And so some linguists, historical linguists, have taken upon themselves to try to work out what that language would have been like, what its vocabulary and syntax would have been, to reconstruct a language for which we don't have any surviving evidence, based on the words and the grammar that we find in what are presumably the offspring of the original and lost language. The notion is then that if you can do that with languages, perhaps you can do that with other elements of culture, including religious practice. So that's what we're going to be coming back around to that's relevant to looking at Druidism and reconstructing Druidism. But first I want to look just for a little bit at a little more closely at the idea of reconstructing languages. The Celtic peoples are usually identified by the fact that they speak or spoke Celtic languages. What's a Celtic language? Celtic language is one of a number of currently existing or extinct languages that are similar enough to be grouped into a family, and that family has, by convention, come to be called Celtic. Interestingly, that word really wasn't applied to this family of languages until quite late, I think the 17th century. Actually, no, more like the early 18th century. Other families of languages that have been seen to be similar to the Celtic languages include the Italic family, more popularly known as the Romance languages, such as French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, a few others. Those are mostly derived from Latin originally. There were some other contemporary languages, contemporary to Latin, that were also part of the Italic family, and most of those have died off. The remaining languages in that group are basically offspring of Latin. The Germanic languages are part of this family. That includes the English language that I'm speaking right now, German language, Dutch, Afrikaans in South Africa. Other groups would be Slavic and Baltic in primarily the east and northeast parts of Europe. Languages as far away as the southern part of Asia, the so-called Indo-Iranian family of Indo-European languages, which would include in India such languages as Hindi and its ancestor Sanskrit, which was the sacred language that the priesthoods of India wrote down, or originally orally transmitted and then later wrote down their sacred texts. And also in ancient Persia, the language that we now know as Farsi, or has become Farsi, the language of Iran these days. Those languages in India and ancient Persia and contemporary Iran are Indo-European languages. They're the Indo part of Indo-European. If all of these languages have resemblances that were pronounced enough for linguists to notice them, and even people who weren't really linguists, just sort of armchair, not professional linguists, but armchair linguists, they're pronounced enough for people to notice the similarities, then it's reasonable to assume that these various families were once upon a time perhaps dialects of a lost so-called proto-language. And that language is usually called PIE, Proto-Indo-European. If the languages descended from a common, if lost, proto-language, then maybe, as I say, other elements of the descendant cultures also can be traced back to a proto-ancestor. So, for example, if Druidism were the pagan religion of the people who spoke Celtic languages, for the most part, as a generalization, and we can find contemporary pagan religious practices in other Indo-European language-speaking cultures, and if there are similarities there, then maybe they are indeed offspring of some original Proto-Indo-European religious system. And out of that, then, where we find gaps or incomplete testimony about what the Druids were up to, maybe it's reasonable to survey the other pagan religions that were contemporary or roughly contemporary to Druidism, the other Indo-European contemporaries, and also maybe to look at what we think we might understand as a Proto-Indo-European religious system, pagan religious system. And where there is enough evidence, where we seem to find the same things happening frequently enough, use those elements to help fill out our understanding of what the Druids were up to. Now, not everybody, I suppose, would agree that you can reconstruct a religion like you can reconstruct a language. Not everybody really agrees on the degree to which you can reconstruct a language. You can buy a dictionary of Proto-Indo-European. If you've got the American Heritage Dictionary, you've probably got such a dictionary in the back of that dictionary. And it's a pretty reliable one. And you'll recognize the Proto-Indo-European words because they have an asterisk in front of them. And that asterisk in front of the word is a signal from linguists that that's a word for which there's no evidence, that there's no so-called attestation. You can't find it anywhere in any text. It's a hypothetical word. So if you see that little asterisk there in front of an Proto-Indo-European root, it means that it's a hypothetical, reconstructed word. And what that means is we don't know that anybody ever spoke that word ever in the history of mankind. We're just thinking that the probability is that they did. That's a best guess as to what people who were ancestral to the Italic and the Celtic and the Germanic and the Slavic and the Baltic peoples might have had among their vocabulary, that they might have used those words. The point being that there actually are multiple reconstructions. There's not a definitive agreement as to what these Proto-Indo-Europeans would have spoken, right? There are people who write poems in Proto-Indo-European and so forth, but we don't know that anybody living back in that era actually would have understood the poem if you read it to them. Again, it's just a best guess. And so we have to be cautious also, I think, with applying reconstruction, the technique of reconstruction to religion. Having said all of that, having issued all those caveats, all that qualification, it's worth talking about what some of the other traditions were, some of the other Indo-European paganisms were. What I said sort of are roughly the contemporaries to Druidism. Let me start as far away geographically as I can. We'll go all the way to India. And there's a good reason to start there because there's actually a very full literary tradition left over from the pagan religions, sort of pre-Hindu paganism, if you will, of India. That's often called Vedism or Vedism, after the Vedas or Vedas, which are the sacred books that were eventually set down in writing after probably something like 1,000 years of oral transmission. One of the interesting things about the Sanskrit language is the reason it survived is because these texts, the sacred texts of pagan India, were meant to be transmitted from generation to generation verbatim. And so when they were finally written down, at roughly the same time period we're talking about here in the Celtic lands with the Druids, that when they were finally set down, they were being recorded by people who were speaking basically a different language at that point. We were moving into, I don't know if it was actually Hindi, but something akin to Hindi. It was not Sanskrit anymore. And so you had people writing down these archaic verses in an archaic language that were being spoken as sort of sacred sounds in a certain sense. They were words that, other than the priesthood, the lay people would not have understood. It's not that different, I suppose, from the experience of Catholics going to Latin Mass, right, prior to Mass being allowed to be said in the vernacular. For many, many centuries, Catholics around the world attended Mass in Latin, and there's a good chance you didn't understand hardly any of it. That's kind of the experience of the Vedas when they were set down in India finally after many generations of oral transmission. They were fossilized. Well, we don't just have the Vedic tradition to look at there. Sort of next door in ancient Persia, now Iran, we have what I think is probably the closest thing to a surviving Indo-European pagan religion. That's Zoroastrianism. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's become mostly a community religion these days. most of the adherents of Zoroastrianism don't live in Iran anymore. They live in India, and where they're known as Parsis. There are a fair number of Zoroastrians in LA, actually. Zoroastrianism is essentially a fire cult. Now, different Zoroastrians will react differently when you say that. Some of them take great umbrage at the notion that their religion is described as having a sacred fire, because Zoroastrians are monotheists, and literally they believe that they profess that they worship only one God, and that fire is some sort of reflection or avatar or symbol of that one God. But some Zoroastrians will admit that, yeah, they see fire as sacred. They see the fire altar that offerings are made into as sacred in and of itself. And I've never had the opportunity to witness any Zoroastrian worship, but I understand that one of the things they do is veil the faces of the priests who are actually working with the fire, because their breath would profane it. It's that sacred. Zoroastrianism is a reform of ancient polytheistic Persian paganism, another ancient Indo-European paganism. Zoroaster, which is his Greek name, or Zarathustra, was a monotheistic reformer of Persian paganism. He introduced monotheistic theology into Persian paganism. And so it's taken on different form over the course of 2,500 years or so. But you still see a remnant of the original fire cult, I think, of the original fire sacrifice practices of the ancient Indo-European pagans of ancient Persia. So the evidence begins to build up, and we can start to, I think, speak with a certain kind of confidence that the Druids did, in fact, work with fire. I'll come back to the specific evidence for that in a little bit. I mentioned that the Italic languages, of which Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, are Indo-European languages. So are the Hellenic languages, the languages of Greece. The Greek, these days more politically correctly called Hellenic, paganisms were Indo-European paganisms. So were the religions of Rome, the Roman Empire. We see sacrificial customs in both those areas. People doing things like offering wine and food to the ancestors. We see fire sacrifice. We see the pouring of alcoholic beverages onto altars among the Greeks. And that's another piece of ideology from comparative Indo-European studies that we should consider. Turning our attention back to India for a second, in the Vedic traditions, there was a fairly mysterious substance called soma that was offered into the fire in one of the major periodic sacrifices that was made. Soma was, according to myth, the drink that conferred immortality on the gods and goddesses, but it's also clearly an intoxicant. Now, we don't know what it is. There's no recipe, unfortunately, for soma that survives. There's a lot of speculation about what it was derived from. But what's important to know is that it was an intoxicant and that it was offered in sacrifice. The Greeks were very fond of pouring wine because that was their major alcoholic beverage, intoxicating drink. For the Celts, they may have used mead. In the mythology, the very famous Queen Maeve of Connaught, who's involved in what's probably the most famous myth of the Irish, the Táin Bo Cúailnge, the Pale Rape of Cooley. Maeve appears to be perhaps a sovereignty goddess dressed up as a human queen. That she may be, in the later tellings of the mythology, a sort of a debased version of what was once upon a time, and perhaps some earlier version of the myth, something like a sovereignty goddess. Now, why should that be true? Because her name is related to the word for mead, and it does mean intoxication. And if we can assume reasonably that most of the Indo-European cultures attached great importance to the use of intoxicating beverage in religious ceremonies, then when you see a figure like Maeve, who is critical in the myth and is important by the way in which she inspires or relates to multiple male figures, particularly the king she's wed to, she really looks like the sovereignty goddess. Recall that Indo-Europeans tended to marry their kings to representatives of sovereignty. So Maeve could be a sovereignty goddess, and the fact that her name has to do with intoxication suggests that the use of intoxicants in religious custom, religious observance among the Celts is reasonable to assume. We also find it among the Northern European peoples, the Germanic peoples, the Scandinavians, the Germans, sometimes mead, sometimes ale. All of these beverages are seen as important. And it stands to reason that this might be so. These beverages seem to have a mysterious magical effect on people. Right? They inspired feats of ridiculous bravery on the battlefield, perhaps. I won't get into too much the traditions about the exploits of the warriors among the Indo-European peoples, but there are lots of customs and traditions that have to do with what the Germans and the Norse would call the berserker, right? Somebody who shifts into sort of the form of the bear in battle, becomes sort of non-human. And there may be some relationship between intoxicants and that state of being for the warrior. And there's just something mysterious about the way that honey, for example, turns into mead. You know that yeast is involved somehow, but you don't. You know, they weren't chemists. They don't know why. They learned the recipes. They understood ways to control the process of brewing, fermentation. But there's still something magical about the way that grape juice or honey or barley mash turns into something that will alter your behavior. And so it's an important substance, magical substance, and therefore stands to reason that it would be used in ritual. That would be considered precious, a gift of the gods, and offered back for its value. Well, I just touched on Germanic paganism. We do have some fairly influential evidence that comes out of the Scandinavian traditions in particular, because Scandinavia stayed pagan later than the Celtic lands did. We have interesting customs about the so-called blot, B-L-O-T, which is the rite of offering among the Norse, that again involves the pouring of a libation on hallowed ground. Resonates very strongly with what the Greeks were doing, pouring wine on an altar. Again, as we compare these Indo-European cultures and their religious practices, we see this picture building up of certain, as I said last week, bullet points, right? Sacrificial offerings. And I said last week, just in passing, that the Druidic religion was a sacrificial religion, that it was built around offering to the gods. But now, by bringing in comparisons with other paganisms, other Indo-European paganisms, we can start to speculate in a little more informed way about what sorts of offerings might be made. If Caesar says that they presided over sacrifices, but all he really talks about is human sacrifice, that can't just be it, right? We know there are other kinds of sacrifice. Well, now we can start to get a picture of some of what that might be, and in particular the use of intoxicating beverage or perhaps other intoxicants. That's one way of offering to the gods. Now, I also have mentioned already animal sacrifice, something that flies in the face of contemporary ethics. As a contemporary pagan, I'm pretty vehemently opposed to it, and I sometimes get in arguments with people who are hunters and practicing pagans, or farmers for that matter, who want to be able to humanely slaughter in a ritual fashion, as their ancestors might have done. To me, I think we're sort of past the time and place where animals need to be killed for, to be used as a gift to the gods. That there are probably other things the gods would be happy with. But for the ancients, certainly animal sacrifice was important. What were they doing when they sacrificed an animal? they were preparing a meal to share with the gods and goddesses. They were preparing to offer hospitality to these mighty powers who they saw as important allies in their day-to-day and year-to-year existence. And this is something else that we think goes back to Proto-Indo-European precedent, the shared meal with the gods. There's a notion that among, say, the hypothetical nomadic pastoral Indo-European peoples in what's now the Ukraine, north of the Black Sea, that they may have had something that I like to think of as kind of a ritual picnic blanket, some sort of turf mat, if you will, onto which the prepared meal for the gods would be placed. It would be left exposed to the sky, essentially, to the elements. And the people would join in the feast. The rest of the animal wasn't just thrown away. It was prepared as you would prepare an animal in an agricultural society for consumption. And then the people dined in the company of the gods and goddesses, which I find to be a fascinating image that we've sort of lost a little bit. The notion that deity isn't something that's remote and judgmental, removed from us and orchestrating our lives, but that rather it's possible to have a kind of a more mutual relationship, a dynamic relationship, where you have a certain responsibility to keep the gods and goddesses' existence fed. And in contemporary life, I think it's certainly possible to look at that on a symbolic and a psychological level, that we perhaps want to sustain ancestral practices by giving importance to them. But for the ancients, they literally felt the need to give literal sustenance, literal food and drink to the gods. And I think that's always sort of worth reflecting on, that for people for whom these resources may have been scarce indeed, they set aside some certain portion of the food on these occasions for their unseen companions, allies, inspirations, and teachers and mentors. I wish I knew more about the evidence that's come out of Eastern and Northeastern Europe from the Slavic and Baltic peoples. The Balts, peoples of places like Lithuania, Latvia, Prussia, actually had paganism perhaps down into the 20th century. There are reports of pagan communities in remoter parts of Baltic republics into the mid-20th century. I haven't ever really looked at what that evidence is and what they were supposedly up to that would qualify them as being pagan. But it is true that Lithuania was the last kingdom to convert from paganism to Christianity, and that wasn't until the 14th century. It was quite late. But because those nations were behind the Iron Curtain for so long, and because Soviet academics were always so suspicious and sparing and sharing their work with people in the West, with scholars in the West, it's really only been since the fall of the Soviet Union that a lot of that information is coming out. It hasn't really sort of filtered down much to the sort of popular press level. But I think it will begin to, and increasingly do so. But what evidence we do have out of those places is for very much the same kind of thing: polytheism, multiple gods and goddesses, sacrificial practice, and so on. One of the things that scholars who've spent time comparing these Indo-European traditions have come up with, and in broad strokes still lean to, is a notion that these societies had a roughly threefold division, that they were, as modern India, Hindu India still is, sort of built around roughly a caste structure. And you'll find, if you do much reading about Indo-European studies, the so-called tripartite model of Indo-European society, three-part model of Indo-European society, and that there were three social quote-unquote functions. You see that word used a lot. Starting at the, not to be pejorative, bottom function, the third function, so-called, that was the so-called producer function. That's the agriculturalists. That's the artisans, people who made the things that allowed you to function in day-to-day society, and most importantly, it's the people who produced food, without which none of the three functions survives. The second function is most loosely thought of as the warrior function. And that is the group of people who specialized in sort of protecting the boundaries of the culture, if you will. And I won't go into what I've already sort of touched on, is all the different mythology and customs and apprehensions around the role of the warrior. But just to put it very briefly, the warrior was always understood as a potentially dangerous component, but necessary component of society. They had to exist. They had to exist to protect the culture. But if left uncontained, wrapped up in bloodlust, the warrior could do as much damage to the community as it could to the enemy, supposed enemy. And so there are all sorts of customs and prohibitions and taboos that attach themselves to the warrior. And more importantly, the first function, which is often called the magico-legal function, or legal-religious, or any of a number of other combinations. That first function, in some ways, provided a check and balance. This was the function that was the glue that held society together, that carried all of those taboos and legal customs and precedents and all the many generations of sacred verses that had been composed. This was the function that included, for the Celts, the Druids, included the Brahmins in India, and it probably included the king. So you had both what some people will even describe as a kind of a shamanic side to the first function, the specialists who dealt with the other worlds and with the unseen things, with the gods and goddesses and the spirits, and then and rendered judgments and performed ritual based on that. But then also other important functionaries who provided order to society, around whom society, in a certain sense, was organized and radiated, that would include, most importantly, the king. Now, you'll see different versions of this this structure, some of which the king is actually above the three functions, and some he's associated more closely with the second function. Different scholars have different ideas about this, and not everybody believes in it anymore. But it's a common enough paradigm, common enough model for understanding Indo-European culture that it's worth, sort of getting in the back of your head, this notion of three functions, and that at the top were these religious functionaries that would have included the Druids, that they were part of the so-called first function of these societies. This notion of things divided into three doesn't just come up because of the structure of the society. We see in the mythologies of these different peoples an awful lot of importance attached to things being in threes. We see things like gods or goddesses in some of the carvings as being sort of threefold, or referred to as threefold. A common example, and this actually comes out of sort of the Christian era, is Bridget, the Irish goddess, who's ultimately sort of a hearth goddess, probably a fire goddess of one sort or another, being associated with, there's a sort of three Bridgets who are associated with poetry, with healing, and with smithcraft, with metalwork, artisanship. This dividing of things into threes or replicating things threefold is very common in Indo-European society. So again, it's worth sort of reflecting on, if you read a tale or a myth, that sort of motif. Do things occur in threes? Does this pop up from time to time? And if so, what might the importance of that be? Threefold division isn't the only division. There's dividing of things into four and even into five. We have various forms of evidence from the Celts themselves. I've already talked briefly about archaeology, the evidence from archaeology, some of the funeral practices, burying of grave goods with important people, suggesting that they're going to go on to another existence in the other world that's like their existence in this world, and where they're going to need their stuff. They're going to need their important things. We have various inscriptions that give us the names of various gods. We have certain cult sites, places where offerings were made over a period of years, presumably to one or more gods or goddesses, some of whose names we know. For example, at the source of the river Seine in France, which was then Gaul, Sequana was the goddess to whom offerings were made at the source of the river, the sacred site there. The mythology among the Celts was not recorded in writing until after the Druidic religions had passed from the scene and Christianity had taken firm hold over these lands. But some Christian scribes in monasteries found this mythology important enough, or at least interesting enough, to set it down in writing. And that's doesn't happen until quite late. These tales may have been set down in manuscripts that do not survive from, say, the 7th or 8th century. The manuscripts that do survive are from much later. They may be copies of the earlier manuscripts, but they weren't themselves actually written down weren't created until at least the 10th or 11th century, and in some cases later than that. So they're much later than the conversion of these places to Christianity as the dominant religion. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to the Christian scribes who did preserve this material, but we also have to look at the preserved material with something of a grain of salt, because in some cases, the best example would be the so-called Irish Book of Invasions. There's clearly a lot of insertion of biblical material in order to kind of make it safe for Christian consumption. The Book of Invasions is sort of, I think I mentioned last week, a chronology of the coming of various pre-human beings into Ireland and the sort of formation of the landscape of Ireland. But it starts out linking back to the biblical flood. And so it's sort of tied into biblical history. And then eventually you get to what was probably remnants of Irish myth, but we have to be careful in how much credence we give to that, and how much we really believe it's authentic Irish myth versus heavily edited Irish myth, heavily edited by people who were Christian clerics. So after surveying all of this evidence, the direct evidence that survives from the mythologies, what we have of them, the archaeology, such as we can make sense of it, the lives of the saints, some Christian literature, like the life of St. Patrick, which I've already mentioned, and then fleshing this out with the evidence from the other Indo-European paganisms. What can we make of the broad strokes of ancient Druidism now? Some of these points I mentioned last week, but we can flesh a little bit of it out more. And some of it will make more sense now that I've surveyed some of the other evidence. Veneration of the ancestors. We find throughout the Indo-European world, the Germanic peoples are a really good example of this. Heavy emphasis placed on reciting genealogies, on learning and reciting genealogies. So we know that who you're descended from was important to these peoples. And as I've indicated, there was also a great deal of importance attached to burial and funerary customs. Sacrifice, right? The making sacred of things, the offering of valuable things to the gods and goddesses or to local spirits whom you wanted to be on good terms with. Sometimes you would offer into the ground or into the well or into a spring, presumably to beings of the place that were in the earth or in the water. And those might be tangible metal objects, things of that nature. But we can also speculate that there were offerings into fire. We have good reason to assume that from the prevalence of fire cults throughout the Indo-European world. And then also that there must have been recurring shared meals, animal sacrifice, meals being shared with the gods. It's just too common. There's too many pieces of evidence for it not to have been pretty critical. And that could be as simple, by the way, as a Roman custom that existed of honoring Vesta, the goddess in the hearth fire in the home, by offering from your noonday meal into the hearth, and which is the sort of thing that contemporary people can do. Now, maybe you don't have a hearth at home, but this gesture of even giving something relatively token, but still intrinsically worthwhile to the land, hell, to the animals of the land, right? To whatever in the natural world around you attach importance to, that giving something, even a token something, from you to them, I think is a really healthy practice to get into. Getting oneself into a mindset of the importance of giving, and even trying to give unconditionally is a healthy ideology to adopt, I think. And it's very much at the core of what these ancient peoples did. I've suggested last week that worship at boundary or liminal places is important. Hilltops, springs, the place where water comes out of the land, the hilltop where the land gives way to the sky were important because those are natural transitions from one state to another. But another element that we can consider, just to return to it for a moment, is fire. Fire is something that changes things. It takes them from one state to another when you burn them. And so fire is in itself a boundary. And it's a boundary that you can create in an altar. And hence, great importance laid on, for example, among the Vedic peoples, building a fire altar in a customary and proper way for the proper giving of offering. And a last point, and I actually just touched on it indirectly a moment ago, in these ancient practices, there was very much a local and even a family component to religious practice. We're very much accustomed in contemporary life to religions that are, to religious communities that are governed from afar, that are governed by a pontiff in Rome, or by votes that are taken at an annual general meeting of a denomination held somewhere hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where you might live, and that from these individuals or these bodies of individuals, doctrine emerges, shifts in doctrine are proclaimed, and the community is sort of expected to toe the line, which understandably breeds all kinds of tensions that play out from time to time in the media or the press. Ancient paganisms, ancient Indo-European paganism, including the religions that the Druids would have been involved in, were, I can't say ground up, but they had a much more important role for the head of the household, for the family living in the household, and perhaps for people living in extended sort of clan groups. I already mentioned the importance of the householder's fire in ancient Indian practice. I mentioned the offering to the hearth. The fire that was kept burning and attended to in the home in most of these places was critical. It wasn't just a thing. It was a part of the family in a certain sense. It was a living presence, dynamic, breathing, respiring presence in the home. And it was treated with that kind of respect. It was treated in a certain sense as an important part of, indeed a member of the household. The ancient Indian peoples actually had a god who was the fire, Agni, which is related to words like ignite or igneous, right? It's a word for fire. Agni was both god of fire, and he was also the fire itself. And there's a verse that describes him as sacrifice and sacrificer. He was constantly self-consuming because he was the fire. But at the same time, because the fire was the conduit for sacrifice, for offerings to go to the gods and goddesses, he was referred to as the priest of the gods. He was the being who would carry the sacrifices on behalf of the people to his fellow gods and goddesses. That image of the fire is, I think, really important. And so you can see it as something that everybody would be close to in their daily lives, that their fire was in some way always around, because in those times, particularly pre-electricity, you didn't want to be without fire, particularly in northern places like Ireland, Scandinavia, and so on. So one dealt with this sacred entity in one's home, in one's daily life. Practices, religious customs could be built around it within the home, into contemporary times, into the late 19th century in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, for example. Fairly elaborate charms and incantations, prayers were collected that have to do with the daily maintenance of the fire in the home, both the rekindling it in the morning and the smoring it or bedding it down at night, keep the embers alive overnight without the fire roaring and consuming too much fuel while everyone is asleep. These are Christian prayers, but if you read them, you'll find that they have a very ancient feel to them. Any number of them reference Bridget, for example, who we know is heavily associated with hearth customs among the Celts, and was probably in some sense a hearth goddess. So individuals dealt directly with the gods and goddesses in this way and in other ways, in making petitions, making prayer tablets and tossing them into a shrine, much the way we might throw a coin into a wishing well or a lucky fountain. There was not a perceived need for a hierarchy of ordained individuals, consecrated individuals, who were worthy of dealing with the gods. There was no theology like you'll find in many Christian denominations where the altar rail in the church separates the lay people from those people who are allowed to go and deal with and do the sacred things with God. That artificial division didn't exist for these ancients. But there was, and we'll talk about this in the lecture that deals with seasonal festivals, there was a kind of a hierarchy of occasions, if you will, including things like what I've already mentioned, the inauguration of a king, where the community would come together and would do much more elaborate and much more traditionally ordained ceremonies that would have been presided over by the Druids. And that was one of the important roles of the Druids in the society, was to serve as those holders of custom, those holders of tradition, who were able to properly manage and orchestrate and lead these important ceremonies where many families, where many tribes would come together, where indeed, if we believe the Irish traditions, indeed the entire island focused its attention on one place on an important hinge point in the year, looking at the hill of Ishnek at one occasion, and the hill of Tara on another, as being the center of the island, where fire would be lit that would essentially radiate out and resupply the hearths of all the people throughout the land. Just going to touch on the more recent history of Druidism for a few minutes, partly because I want to come back around to, at least briefly, to what's going on these days in practical terms, in terms of reconstructing Druidism. As with a lot of pre-Christian thought and practice, much of the writings that dealt with the Druids, and therefore the evidence for their existence and what, as I say, they were up to, was set aside by the conversion to Christianity. And it wasn't until the Renaissance, when Europeans became a little bit more comfortable with the idea of the worth of the human being that was espoused by the ancients, by the Greeks and the Romans particularly, that people began to read some of the ancient manuscripts again, started to read things like Julius Caesar's memoirs, and started to think about some of the references in there. And there were these mysterious figures, the Druids, who were being referred to in various of these manuscripts. In France and in England, where much of this reconsideration was going on, there weren't really any surviving Druids, so to speak. There were, as I say, folk magicians under that name still in Ireland, perhaps, and maybe in Scotland, but elsewhere, not so much. And so there was this sort of blank slate that emerged from this really fragmentary evidence into which people were allowed to kind of project their own personal view of the universe and their own personal view of metaphysics and the supernatural and the divine order of things. And because this was a point in time, and here we're talking about the 17th and 18th century, where there was an upsurge of fraternal orders like Masonry, like Freemasonry, that believed in a kind of one overarching creator and a universal brotherhood of man, the Druids were seen as possibly models of this kind of order. And so there were fraternal organizations that adopted the name, styled themselves as Druids in this period. But they really had very little to do with the kind of pagan religion and pagan religious officials that I've been describing. And it isn't really until at least the late 18th century where we actually start to see one or more individuals exploring the idea of the relationship of the image of the Druid to seasonal ritual. There's a fellow by the name of Edward Williams, a Welshman, who went by the pen name of Iolo Morganwg, who wrote an elaborate text called Bardas, which has been proved to be something of a forgery, mostly a forgery, although he claimed it to be a compendium of ancient bardic texts. But Edward Williams, Iolo's importance is that he convened the first real sort of Druidic ritual in 1792 on the autumn equinox. And really, I think you can trace the genuine beginnings of a revival of Druidism as a possible spiritual path, as opposed to a fraternal order, to that point in time. That tradition in the UK has given rise to a number of Druid orders, which tend to be relatively philosophical, though spiritual and philosophical. They tend to be earth-centered. They tend to focus on a belief in a god and goddess rather than any number of gods and goddesses. And it's mostly been since the early 1960s that we start to see individuals using the term Druid in something more like the original sense of the word. In the early 60s at Carleton College in Minnesota, there was a group of students who were none too pleased with the chapel requirement of their school and found a loophole to get out of it by inventing their own religion, which they called the Reformed Druids of North America. And by adopting that as their religion, the notion was they could get out of going to chapel as long as they went off and held their own religious observances. And interestingly, as some of those students moved elsewhere, it took on a life of its own. And at some point in that life, people started to look at what it actually meant to have been a Druid once upon a time. And some of those individuals actually started to attach some importance to the work of the ancient Druids and started to think about at least a vaguely Celtic form of modern pagan practice. Probably the most influential of those people was a fellow by the name of Isaac Bonowitz, who was a member of RDNA, who then spurred a sort of an offshoot called the New Reformed Druids of North America, the NRDNA, which attempted to be a little bit more scholarly in its orientations, that attempted to use the evidence that I've been sort of discussing for ancient Druidism as a foundation for modern religious practice. And that didn't go far enough for Isaac, so Isaac then subsequently left, and with a few other interested individuals, started a group called Arnriacht Féin, or ADF. The Irish name basically means Our Own Druidism. I was a member of that organization for a number of years. Was actually on its national board for quite a while. And it's a fascinating resource to get a sense of how an active practice of reconstructing Druidism might lead to a religious system that you can actually practice. Because they do show you what a lot of interested, fertile minds can bring to the task of reviving Druidism as a viable spiritual practice. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, in a few weeks I'm going to start a 7-week series called Elements of Druidism that sort of tackles several of the topics I've been discussing just in brief form right now at greater length and looks at the way they can be integrated into contemporary life. So that's a brief commercial for something yet to come. And that will be it for what I have to say tonight.